right, so I've got a great question for us this morning. One that if you're a pessimist, you're going to love it. If you're a real optimist, then this will be something that you probably haven't even thought of yet this week. But what is the worst thing that happened to you this week? What was the worst part of your week last week? It could be the sunburn you're about to get at church. I don't know. Maybe it was a jerk in your office at work, or a difficult customer or patient or difficult student. If you're a teacher, I'm sure they're all difficult this time of year. Maybe it was an unexpected financial setback, a reoccurring worry. Maybe your schedule is just really full and it never let up. Could be mental anguish you dealt with this week, marital struggles, a personal attack, an embarrassing mistake. Maybe me just listing this has brought up some of those things. But the reality is that regardless of whether it was really serious, a family member who is ill, or whether it was something very, very slight this week, all of us suffered in some way, because suffering is an inevitable part of life. And because it's an inevitable part of life, we have to respond well to it. We have to ask ourselves, how do I respond to suffering? So how did you respond to the difficulties you faced this last week? As I went through my little litany, what came to mind? And how did you respond? Did you respond in anger? Did you sin in anger? Did you sin in cowardice? Did you immediately drop to your knees in prayer? If someone made you mad, did you pray for that person? If you made a big mistake, did you confess it? How did you respond? Would you have wanted someone to video your response and post it on social media? Certainly everybody wants to do well with suffering, right? To take it well. No one wants to be that gentle flower that wilts at the slightest heat of life. No one wants to be the person who always plays the victim card when we have our first world problems, like it's a little sunny at church. We all want to take our difficulties admirably. But today, in Romans 5, we hear some incredible words regarding suffering. He says in verse 3, we rejoice in our sufferings. I mean, it's one thing to go through suffering stoically, and a lot of us would love to just settle for that, just to not get all bent out of shape about it. But to go through suffering with joy. This seems to be the biblical expectation, or at least exhortation or hope, is that we rejoice in sufferings. And so we see Paul and Silas in Acts 16 singing hymns as they are shackled in prison. Or of Jesus, we hear these words in Hebrews 12, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross. Jesus' teachings on Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, he said, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely. Rejoice and be glad. Now, this is not to say that we should like suffering. Remember, St. Paul asked that God will remove the thorn in his flesh multiple times. Jesus, before he went to the cross, asked the Father, if there's any other way, Lord, take this cup from me. So God's not calling us to be masochists, to like suffering. But how do we have joy in the midst of it? Is it possible to have joy in suffering? And so today in Romans 5, verses 3 through 5, we're going to be looking at how Christians can fight for joy even as we suffer. How do we fight for joy even as we suffer? All right, so if you have a Bible, open it up to Romans chapter 5. And if not, you can follow along in your service guide. The verses are there, Romans 5, and we'll be looking at 3 through 5 this week. So Paul says in Romans 5, verse 3, he says, not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings. Just want to pick this verse apart a little bit. That phrase, not only that. Whenever somebody says, well, not only that, they're clearly referencing something that they just said, right? And last week, we saw what came before, that we are justified, made right before God only by faith. And that with this justification comes positive peace, shalom, reconciliation with God. That with this justification comes access to God. That we have, as it were, the ear of the most powerful person in the world. And that what comes with this justification is not only this positive peace and this access, but also hope, optimism, real optimism for our future, because God has gone to such great lengths to make us right with him. We know he will take us all the way. That all comes as a result of our justification. And Paul is thinking about those things, and he says, but not only that, there's more. It's almost like a guy selling something on TV. It's like, there's even more. And he's saying, even more than that, we don't just have this joy in our future hope, but we have joy even now in our suffering. You could say this verse this way. He says, not only do we have the promise of eternal joy in heaven, but we also have joy in our sufferings now on earth. What kind of sufferings is he talking about? Well, it could be just general sufferings, from allergies to cancer, from old age to growing pains of being a teenager, okay? But some theologians think that Paul here has in mind the suffering in particular that comes from being a Christian. And it's because of the Greek word that he uses. It's thlipsis, and it tends to mean being pressed, tends to mean persecution. And certainly, being a Christian does involve suffering. Every Christian is called to carry Paul says, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ will be persecuted. Again, I always make fun of K-Love. That's never the verse for the day on K-Love. There's no Christian t-shirts with that printed on it. So every human being alive is going to experience some suffering in general, but it's only those who follow Jesus who will face suffering for walking with him. And as it turns out, suffering for walking with Jesus is an essential aspect of the Christian life. Like if someone came up to you and said, hey, what does it mean to be a Christian? What does life look like? Also, suffering for Jesus. This is a major theme in the scriptures. Remember what Jesus said, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. That's pretty essential. Anyone that would be a disciple of Jesus has to bear a cross. One reason why it's also an essential aspect of the Christian life is because Christians are called in every single generation to live faithfully to God's eternal word. And this always, no matter what time you live in, it always makes a Christian counter-cultural. Christians in that (1940s) America, you would have been countercultural to oppose racism, to oppose unjust warfare, to oppose unjust economic policies and the idolatry of nationalism. You might say, wow, not a lot has changed. To be a faithful Bible-believing Christian today means to oppose abortion, which is the murder of innocent children. It's to call the world to walk in God's ways